Here. Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you for catching that. I didn't see how I did that. Let me try this again. Okay, well, it'll be interesting to see what shows up on the recording here. I think I'm sharing these slides, but at least the people in the room can see these. We'll go from here. So again, I'm Brett Kelver. I'm a planner with the city here, and we wanted to have this meeting tonight to let people know who have property that includes some floodplain designation, what changes may be coming with some rules that we're being asked to change with respect to some new regulations from FEMA, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So with that in mind, just a quick overview. This is a big picture of the whole city, and the areas in blue and orange are what are designated as our floodplain areas. The blue is the most essential part of it. That's the 100-year floodplain. That's where we actually regulate. The orange designation is the 500-year floodplain, so a lot less anticipation of flooding. We don't currently regulate those areas, but you can see that for the most part, our areas of floodplain regulation are along the two major creeks and the Willamette River. So if you're a property owner along Kellogg Creek or Johnson Creek or near the Willamette, you may have dealt with some of these regulations before. Just for a little bit more detail, the area that has got the red cross hatching, that is actually the floodway designation. That's kind of the area within the floodplain where you would expect in a flood event, there would actually almost be like a channel of water moving. That is, the regulations in those areas are even higher because it's an area of critical concern. But otherwise, the blue area is kind of where you would generally expect flood water to spread out in a flood event. Now, the rules that we already have flood hazard regulations in the code. They're in Title 18 of the Municipal Code, which you can find online if you'd like to look. And we've updated it over time. It was first adopted in 1980, and it's been updated a few times, 2002, 2008, and most recently in 2021, usually in response to directives we've gotten from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And part of these rules are what enable us to participate, the city, to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP. That's what allows people on floodplain properties to purchase federally subsidized flood insurance. Without that, those folks you'll be kind of on your own for the private market, I guess. So it's been designated an important thing for the city to do what it needs to do to remain eligible for the National Flood Insurance Program, so that the residents of Milwaukee can have access to that service. And some of the basic aims of these rules are the most important principles. We're trying to regulate development in a way so that any new development doesn't create flooding problems for properties up or downstream. So generally the principle is, if you are adding some fill within the floodplain, you need to balance it by removing some fill as well, so that there's no net change in capacity. So again, in a flood event, hopefully there's no net change for anyone, because we are trying to avoid damage to property. And these regulations don't prohibit development in the floodplain, they simply provide the rules and standards for it. So again, some of you may be more familiar with this if you've actually done some development projects. There's what's called a base flood elevation. That's the area where the flooding is expected or predicted to be for a typical 100-year event. And it's the regulations, for example, require you to build at least 1 foot above that elevation, so that in the event of a predicted flood, that those improvements are expected to be safe. Obviously, that doesn't always happen, and with things changing and events becoming a little more severe, that may not always be enough, but those are the rules that we're working with. Now, the reason for this project is a result of what's been happening for over a decade, really, at the federal level. There have been some lawsuits, some challenges to FEMA and its operation of the National Flood Insurance Program over concerns that the program and the development that it allows ends up resulting in negative impacts to species that are on the endangered species list. So this has been something that's been going back and forth in the courts, lawsuits, and different federal agencies. And so we've known for a while that some new rules were going to be coming. And we've been waiting for more direction about those. And just in the last couple months, we've finally started to get some more information about how it looks like things are heading with that. And again, I think the key understanding is that FEMA is providing us with some direction about what changes we may need to make so that we remain eligible to stay in the National Flood Insurance Program. The key principle at play here is this concept of no net loss. The idea is we're already doing that with, like I said before, the flood storage capacity aspect of things. That is, when you're developing in the floodplain, you need to show that there is no net change in the flood storage capacity. That's already essentially a requirement. The new pieces that are coming with that, the things that have kind of been added are concerns and questions about water quality and also riparian vegetation. And I can explain a little bit more about how those things look like they're going to manifest themselves with the new rules. The initial deadline that we were given and other communities in the state were given was December 1st. And I'll say, let's see a little bit more about that. There were 3 options that we were given to at least in the interim while things are being finalized at the federal level. FEMA is requiring communities to take some kind of preliminary action. And so these pre-implementation compliance measures or PICMs, we were presented with 3 options. One option was to simply prohibit new development in the floodplain. A second option was to adopt a model ordinance that FEMA was providing to us, which looks a lot like the ordinance that we have already, the flood protections that we have already, but with some highlighted changes that we need to make. Or the third option was to require assessment on a project by project basis. So we evaluated these different options. There's been a lot of conversation about legally what we could do and by when. Again, FEMA had a deadline of December 1st. We in Oregon have requirements before we adopt local ordinances. We have to provide public notice and go through a whole process. So we have this interesting situation where FEMA has been saying, I need you to do certain things by December 1st. And we're saying, I hear you. We are going to need a little more time than that because we have to go through a process. So what we are doing is doing our best and moving kind of as quickly as we can. And I'll say something about our assessment of the options that we were presented. Prohibition did not seem like the direction we wanted to go, in part because we already don't prohibit development. We allow development in the floodplain subject to certain rules and standards. And so to simply prohibit development in the floodplain seemed out of alignment with what we already do. That number 3 option, the permit by permit assessment, our read on that was that not only was it probably going to be more complicated for projects and had some more discretionary elements in it, that is where it's not clear. I can't give you a black and white list of things that you need to do to comply. It's going to be more involved with that. Those 2 options did not seem like what we wanted to do kind of in the interim. Both of them would actually have required some of that official action, which would take, in our process would take a couple of months anyway. So where we landed was pursuing the second option, that is adopting the model ordinance or really modifying our current rules to implement the new parts of it. And so the points I've got listed here are just kind of highlighting that we're already working with code that is based on models that we've been given before. So in these updates that I mentioned in 2008, 2021 have been based on direction that we've gotten from the state and from FEMA already. And then part of what will be included in those rules is some standards related to this no net loss principle that we can talk about a little bit more. Some of the particulars with that include some tree planting. There's a consideration for fish access. That would be a new thing. And the point that I'm making here is that I think that we will essentially the model code gets at kind of a project by project assessment in that when we have code and you come to the city with a project, we're gonna use that code. It's gonna take you through, walk you through some steps of what you have to do or show to move through the regulations. So this is the option that that we recommended to the city council, and a couple weeks ago they agreed, yes, that is the direction we should go in. And so what we're doing is we are working to make some adjustments to the model ordinance that we've been given to make it actually workable. And we have a couple of dates identified. One is January 14th. That's when we would go to the planning commission for an initial hearing about the rules that we're going to recommend, the rule changes. And then we're hoping to bring it to the city council on February 4th. So we're trying to move as quickly as we can to meet the spirit of the December 1st deadline that we were given, but working through the appropriate channels. And so what we did, we wanted to share this information with people who have floodplain properties and let you know what we're working with and working on, and try to take the opportunity to explain a little bit more about what we understand and what we're still trying to understand about it, and see what questions you have. So with that, I think I'd like to open it to your questions, and then I think maybe just responding will maybe help flesh out more of what you're wanting to know. So, yes, ma'am.
A couple of definitions. You said make it accessible and more workable, and then there was a habitat assessment. So could you explain what accessible, workable solutions are, and what is a habitat assessment?
Right. The habitat assessment piece of it is what was presented with that third option, that permit by permit assessment, which to us seemed like you were most definitely going to have to engage a professional, like a consultant, to help study the project and explain how it was going to meet all of these different no net loss standards. Now, there may still be some element of that kind of expertise that may be needed even when we incorporate some things in the code, but what we're trying to do is identify how we can make it as clear as possible. So again, the three different principles of flood storage capacity, water quality, and riparian vegetation. There have been some, they call them proxies or indicators for each of those. For the flood storage piece, it's like what I said before. There's already some math that you can do about balancing the fill that might happen and what's called cut, or the removal of material. The new wrinkle on this is identifying this fish accessible or fish egress. That I think we're still trying to figure out how we can set that up to be met in a kind of a clear and objective way. Because I think the idea is we want to balance both things. We obviously want to achieve, help people achieve the no net loss. And so we want to make that as easy as possible, but also where there is a need for some actual expertise, we're going to try to make that clear. But so that is still, that part I still myself don't fully understand how we're gonna make it clear to people what is fish accessible or fish egressable space. But just so you understand, it is in that, I think in that realm of, if you are adding fill within the floodplain area, that's where there would need to be this additional identification of, is there a way for fish to get to it, get in and out of it? So that we're still gonna try to make clear. The water quality piece of it, the proxy for that that's been identified is impervious surface. So I think in a way, hopefully that can be fairly clear. The idea is that within the floodplain, if you're adding new impervious surface, you need to, again, have there be a result of no net change in it. So maybe there's some green infrastructure techniques that can be applied, or what's called low impact development. Maybe you're able to use some pervious materials that will allow water to infiltrate in, so you're minimizing the amount of new impervious surface. And then the third piece, the riparian vegetation, as I understand it, really relates mostly to trees and tree removal. So if your project is involving some removal of trees, there's a fairly straightforward calculation of how to mitigate that, you know, for this many trees, you must replant so many more in the floodplain, so. It would be new, there are new requirements, but they are all kind of in the ballpark, I think, of some things that are already considered already. So, for example, when you are doing work close to a stream, we already have some natural resource buffers. This is maybe extended a little bit from that because it's dealing with the floodplain, which does sometimes go beyond 50 feet from the stream, but that's the effort has been, I think, from FEMA with this model ordinance has been to try to identify these proxy things so they can be a little clearer. If you're doing this, the remedy is this. Does that give a little bit of what you're trying to
Yes.
understand? Okay.
It sounds like you're trying to learn it right
We
alongside us.
are.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's what I want
interestingly,
to
the ordinance that we've been given has been described to us by FEMA as, they say, if you adopt this, you will meet these Endangered Species Act requirements that we're trying to meet. And we say, okay, but then they say it is clear and objective, which the way we implement things, I think it's not entirely. There's some things that still seem a little discretionary. Like when you say things like to the, you know, as little as possible or to the greatest extent possible, those things are not, we don't know what that is. Is what I've done enough or not? Is it black and white, on or off? So we're trying to get things more in that neighborhood where.
So how do we square that with like the length of the? If it seems similar to what we're doing now, how much impact does it have on the length of time to get? Like, how will you, if it's sort of still amorphous to you all, how will that impact permitting time?
Well, I think where we want to end up is that we'd like it to impact as little as possible, right? I think the flood rules are implemented in conjunction with the building permit, right? They're not part directly of our land use zoning code. So the rules that we have about land use applications and we have to issue a decision in 120 days, like that's kind of different from this. So these are rules that are applied when you are going through the building permit process. There's no set time on how long it can take for a building permit. There's often back and forth between the building department and an applicant about have they given enough information. So your question is are the new requirements going to add a significant amount of time to that?
Given that we're not quite sure we all define what it means.
Right, well, I think where we're hoping to end up, where we want to end up by the time, what we take to the city council for adoption is that those things are a lot more clear, that we've made the standards a lot more clear. So it's hard to say right now what it might add.
But you would advise people to hold off till after the ordinance is adopted if they can.
Well, right, I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to get to your question, it's a good question and we don't know yet. I think it's something that is a fair question for us to address in the public hearings that we're gonna have, like mid-January when we go to the planning commission, and then certainly by the end of the city council hearing. We should be able to say something about that. Obviously, those timelines will vary a little bit depending on the specifics of the project, but I think being able to say clearly, here are the new things that you might have to do. It's easier to answer more specific questions when we've had some experience with them to know like how long it ended up taking to find someone to do this or how long this kind of gathering of information took. So we may still be speculating about that, but I think the idea is we should at least be able to present a fairly clear checklist of these are the things you'll need to show. And over time, I guess as we go through with certain projects, we'll get a better sense of what they actually impact.
And it's a function of the decision between those three considerations, you know, that will lead to an understanding of, you know, definitions and then what we can expect with regard to connecting facilities. I mean, good to find out these things, and luckily it is moving fairly quickly, but
Yeah.
I can understand your frustration with not, you know, needing to explain everything and not really understanding where we're at, so.
Right, I think the way I'm approaching it right now is I'm trying to integrate the model ordinance that we've been given and plug it into our code and kind of walk through it. I'm thinking of a couple of recent project examples or ones that we know are maybe coming and trying to use those as an example about what would it mean for this project if it had to go through these things. So I can't give you a great answer right now about what kind of impact it will have, but we will be trying to get clearer about that.
And that clarity shouldn't be frustrating, that clarity is our property, so.
Yeah,
So
well,
thank you for your work.
yeah, we wanna, it's frustrating right now, just trying to pull it together, but the idea is it should be clearly presentable and understandable.
Yeah, I work with Johnsburg Watershed Council a lot on projects. Right now, they've applied to one for the city at the confluence of Johnson Creek. And has that been approved yet?
Didn't you tell me, Arrowhead?
I think it has been, yes, I think it had some actual land use review associated with it. And I think it has been through that,
Okay.
been through that process.
One thing I want to mention on that and what they're going to be doing, you remember the diagram with the two big areas and then the other on the west east side and the two big ones in the creek and then a couple of smaller ones, very small on the west side. And that was all to help the disbursement of water to get the cooler water into the river to help to bring fish in and so on. But there's one thing it doesn't take in, well, I'm concerned about a little bit. There's a lot of trees in that area. Some of them are pretty good size, some are smaller. But, and they catch a lot of garbage in the winter and then they let loose in a big dump when the water really gets higher and flows out. And I'm not concerned with what they're putting in. I'm concerned with the trees that are currently there. And if it's passed, all their tree removal they have scheduled is in place then. I would hope that if they have to replant trees in that area particularly, that they really don't, because we get trees all over the place all the time. As you know, I live right there at the confluence. And it gets pretty crazy in the amount of garbage it holds and then disperses. Not only garbage, but it does start to pick up dirt that flows down and hold it too, which means it's bringing it from further upstream down towards the confluence area. But so all that builds up there. And I really hope if you have them plant trees that you don't, because they'll plant on their own, I guarantee you. Number one. Number two is it will just encourage a bigger mess at the mouth from what is designed. And I wish you had different regulations on trees and sizes you can cut, because it makes no sense. I had to remove a big maple tree that was dying. When we finally cut it, it had a spot like this in the center that was vacant. And it was all dead. And it was within 18 feet of my house, and it was 40, 50 feet tall at least then, but I kept trimming it back because I knew I had a problem anyhow. So when I finally took it down, we had the new permits, I had to go in and do all that. And I had to plant another tree, believe that or not. They don't look at what you already have, they just put a new tree, stick it in. I think that's ridiculous. Personally,
You're
at
talking,
least from my area and right there at the confluence.
so you're talking a little bit about the residential tree.
Or residential or even them working in the creek, because we get trees coming up constantly. Literally speaking, I mean, they're coming all the time because it's dumping dirt and seeds and all that stuff in the creek. And some of this stuff is gonna be dying off with this beetle that's coming anyhow, and then we're gonna have a real mess. And it's just, we're getting too much there, especially at the confluence. I just think it's turning into a jumbled mess slowly.
Well, I want to separate just a little bit, your opinions and experience with the tree removal.
Yes,
Process. I take your point about the concern that whether you're removing any trees or just planting them as part of kind of a larger mitigation area, if you're being required to plant them back in kind of the floodplain area, you're saying that may not always be a great idea in certain
It-
spots because it ends up presenting kind of a barrier or a
Well,
screen
a
or-
barrier or others. I truly had to cut down 2 smaller trees to make room for the replant. I mean, it's ridiculous in some ways. And I told her that after she said it was approved,
Okay, well, see, this.
and I planted the new tree.
All right, I just wanna be clear about that, you're talking a little bit about the residential tree.
Well, that's part of it, but they have a otherwise contract, but it's just, the area gets trees all over the place constantly. We have fir trees, all to the north of my house and area, and there's a lot in there, but that. It's just the general trees, the ash and the other trees, some of them, they're not gonna do so good when this beetle, whatever, comes in and kills off 90% of them.
Well, I'll take your point as maybe the question or concern is there going to, with these new rules?
I hope they don't have to replant a lot of trees.
Well, will there be some consideration for,
What's already there and what's happening
yes,
on a natural basis.
yeah, I think I will say that gets at one point, which is. You know, what we're trying to do on the one hand is create what I would call this clear and objective, you know, on or off, black or white, you meet it or you don't.
Yeah, there is.
Kind of standard, because in terms of timelines for permit review, like you're saying, when there's a very clear, if I do this, I should get approved. To have that track for people, that's where we're trying to get as clear and
Okay.
objective a path as possible, but also to recognize that maybe that doesn't fit for every situation. And so part of the changes could involve maybe what's called a discretionary review, where it's not as simple as the clear and objective. It may take more time, but if you feel like you can't or don't want to meet the clear and objective path, you could opt maybe to go into this discretionary review where you could make the case.
When the tree code came out, that was really wasn't pushed, or just at least told to me when I got the permit to remove my maple.
Okay, well,
But I'm talking about them now and what they're gonna be doing in the creek. I think it's gonna be great for fish and riparian life and all of that. But we don't need we have had an active beaver. I don't have one right now. But I've had one right there. He didn't come in for any permits. He just
well, and I guess another point that I would maybe take from this is, I mean, you are talking to some degree about maybe something that wouldn't necessarily be called traditional development, but a restoration effort where there's maybe some dredging, or you're gonna be putting large woody debris in the stream, or maybe doing some.
They're
tree
going to be
removal.
doing that in their project.
Right, and so if the question is, how is that kind of project affected by the new rules, or how much rigidity is there about what has to be done?
Yeah.
I think that's a good point to take.
But I mean, I just hope they don't have to replace trees if they have to remove them in order to do the project down there. Or it should be looked at very closely.
Well, what if it
And
isn't?
generally speaking, I don't think really we don't need them there. I go down there and remove small ones all the time, not all the time, but often, because it just gets to be a mess.
Well, I think so 2 things, I guess, I'll say one. To me, I forgot, I may have to come back to, well. One note would be, you are also talking about a fairly specific area.
Area, I
Like the
am at the
confluence
confluence,
area
yes.
is pretty dynamic in
It
space.
is,
Now, to be
absolutely.
fair, in a flood type event, the floodplain can be pretty dynamic as well, and similar things could happen, right? You have water, it's where it normally isn't, and maybe trees that are there are catching and straining some things. But I think your area of concern, the confluence, is, obviously it's in the floodplain, but it is kind of unique. I think both that and.
I don't disagree with you. I just wish your tree code was a little different too. So it would help them when they do the work down there, and would have helped me in going through some stuff that I thought was kind of ridiculous.
Right, I guess the other thing I was gonna say, was. There's a. Riparian buffer zone that's identified in the new rules. that is identified as 170 feet from like the ordinary high water mark, or more or less where the top of bank is for a creek. And so that area is an area where if that is an area where some mitigation or tree replanting could happen, I guess the question that might come back to you for the confluence area in particular would be, it's not necessarily a requirement that where a tree is removed, a new tree must be planted right back in
But
place.
you have to do it on your property, and my property, I have over an acre, and I'm busy moving trees constantly.
Right, so all this to say that two things, one. There may be some flexibility with where on the site it could be, like I'm saying, obviously, if you are developing and removing a tree, there's no space to replant the tree because you got permission to put something there in its place. But the idea would be that somewhere within this riparian buffer zone, you find a spot to replant. Now, that may not work in every situation, like you're saying, you have some already heavily forested places, and that's why it might be necessary to have this more discretionary track where you can say, look, my case is a little bit different, I can't meet your clear and objective rules, I don't wanna plant all these trees, it doesn't make sense for my property. And then you may just need to go through this other process.
Yeah, because they're working on 3 different property owners. They're working with MODA, me, and a roadway area that's me and some others own.
Mhm.
And so there are 3 different areas.
So I think you've raised some good points and questions about just other things that we'll wanna be able to clarify is how will the mechanics of this work? When I am trying to mitigate, replant trees, where can I do that? How much flexibility do I have? And maybe it does make a good case for trying to have some kind of a discretionary path that will
Yeah,
work
there
for
should
other-
be for that, because we don't actually need the new trees, we can just remove the wrong ones is the best thing.
Okay, yes, thanks for those points. Here.
Go ahead.
Oh, just you said the riparian buffer zone is 170 feet?
That's what I wanted.
Yeah, what was it before?
Well, there wasn't one before. I
Okay.
think there wasn't an area designated as a riparian buffer zone. That's part of what is a new thing coming in. And to try to explain what I understand so far about it, that's the riparian buffer zone overlays with the floodplain, okay? So if you have a floodplain property, and let's say from the top of bank, on the flood maps, there's only like 100 feet. The floodplain only comes about 100 feet onto your property. The riparian buffer zone kind of stops with the floodplain. It doesn't extend beyond it. So that if you were doing a project outside of the floodplain, but still within 170 feet, we're not talking anymore. It's not, the regulation doesn't apply. It would make more sense on a property where, well, not more sense, but a different situation would be a property that, for whatever reason, the floodplain extends pretty far onto it, like 300 feet, let's say, from the creek. You've got a really flat property. The idea would be that the riparian buffer zone stops 170 feet from there, even though you may still be working in the floodplain. So the new rules would still apply in the floodplain beyond the riparian buffer zone, but it's this new area that's been identified as a focus for, and this no net loss of trying to, take a special look at the vegetation part of it, focusing on tree planting in that.
That makes sense.
I have a question for you about retroactive. Is there anything that would be retroactive to existing development? So if there was like redevelopment, kind of maintenance of existing structures, would there be anything in this new ordinance that affects that?
Let me see if I can restate what you're saying. So if you have existing development and you're wanting to make some changes or improvements to
Say you
that.
had a dock and a gate.
Mhm. That's actually in the river, I guess, too, right? Yeah, so there may be some other issues just with other types of review, like Willamette Greenway review or something like that for that, but as it affects these rules, I think we're still going to be working with the same kind of applicability trigger that is in the code right now. So for example, as I understand it, in our current code, if I have a house and let's say the back half of it is in the floodplain and I'm gonna remodel it or something like that. As long as the changes I'm making to the structure don't rise to a certain threshold that's considered substantial improvement, which is 50% of the market value of the thing, then we're not applying the new rules. You'd probably be advised to put the money that you're spending in the renovation to, like, it'd be a shame if you did all that work and everything was below the base flood elevation, but we wouldn't be able to make you raise things up. Now, if you're doing some work on that same house and it turned out that it was really substantial remodeling and it was gonna be over 50%, then you would be pushed to, you know, make things, you know, meet the current code. So,
But when you say remodeling, you don't mean, you mean on the existing footprint?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. And even, I think we had someone ask about, why don't I just build like a sun porch or put a deck on the back end of the property, into the floodplain? I think even in those cases, we've had to look to see, like, is that substantial improvement? That the addition of something so small, like a deck, is probably not gonna trigger needing to make the whole house meet the flood code. So staying within the same footprint still could trigger it if your project was
Okay.
hitting that trigger. And I think the idea then would be like, you were doing so much to the structure, like more than half of its value. You really need to like make it, I mean, even almost for your own benefit, even though it will probably cost you more money, the idea is, you're doing so much, you need to just make this safer for, you know,
See,
for the flood stuff.
you're basing the trigger on financial expenses.
Yes, I think the code talks about market value and there are, I think FEMA provides some guidance and suggestions about how or where you know, you can get that information, you know, a real estate professional like an appraiser or something like that. And then, yeah, we usually coordinate with our building department about what the value of the work being done.
So in layman terms, what I'm hearing is nothing's really cast in stone. It's case by case and there's some wiggle room, flexibility.
Well, not, I mean, I don't know, I wanna get more specific, when you say nothing's cast in stone, I would say, well, we haven't adopted new rules yet, and we are trying to figure them out. We know what direction we need to go, the rules are going to have to make people show this no net loss for flood storage capacity, for impervious surface, and for vegetation. So it's not completely unknown, we haven't figured out the details yet.
And I don't, what's this well, I don't even know what that means.
Riparian. As I understand, that word refers to, especially in a creek, it's the area, it's kind of an area within a certain distance of the creek. Where you expect, like usually for the health of the stream, it's good to have vegetation, trees, shrubs, things that can provide some shading so that water temperature stays cooler and also that helps filter out things that might be running across the surface of the land.
Our case is probably similar to his, we have a lot of trees. And we have some that are dying, I mean, you can see they're already dead. So when I remove them, am I gonna have to replace a tree for tree? The ones that are already dead there?
My initial answer would be, I don't think so, but maybe, this is where I need to, this gets back to just a tree. Well, I mean, this is the thing, there are some overlapping things, because for a residential property, tree removal is regulated by our tree code. Plus, in a case where you're right down near the stream, there's tree code and there's also the natural resource
Yeah,
code.
I'm talking about the area that's in that natural resource, and it's about 100
Right.
feet from the creek, and you're familiar with our property, it
Yeah.
sweeps down. And then that area, we have several trees that are dead, I mean, they're brown and there's no leaves on them. And they're obviously dead, and I'm gonna have to do something about getting them out of there. Do I have to replace them tree for tree, or is there? I know if in some areas that they qualify forestry land, X amount of trees per acre, is there a tree count? As long as you don't go under that number, you're okay, or do you have to keep X amount of trees on the property?
So the tree code answer to that is, I think if there's no development involved, if you're not adding new dwelling
No,
units.
just they're not to do.
Right, then there's not a specific canopy percentage that you're being required to deal with. There may still be some permit requirements for removal. And then there would also maybe be a natural resource review for the removal. And I'll change my gut answer, it may be Probably the answer is yes, for just removing trees that are within this floodplain area, you probably would be required to replant. And this may get us back to the question of where, how broadly
Well, this is in that
can I do
150
my
foot
replanting?
area.
Right, but I'm saying, I don't know that you would necessarily be required to replant in that exact spot. But you'd probably be required to do that replanting somewhere within this
Well,
riparian
see, I
buffer.
keep hearing maybe, that's what I mean, things aren't cast in stone, that's what I'm hearing.
Right, it's not cast in stone because we haven't totally figured it out, the direction I think it's going, and the
Okay.
question I understand that I need to be able to answer is. Yes or no, will tree removal in the floodplain area require more?
What about blackberries? We get dense blackberries where you can't even walk down through it, you're allowed to remove those?
So let me clarify the buckets. So this floodplain code, as I understand it, is focused on tree removal. So removing blackberries wouldn't require anything different because of the floodplain code. Requiring blackberries is also generally encouraged and okay, as long as it's done in a way that doesn't involve heavy equipment and, tracking stuff in there. But yes, I think removing blackberries is something we
Okay,
want to
okay.
do.
Well, I kind of fall in a funny place where I have a fairly large property as well, it's along the Kellogg Creek there, so I'm working with the Urban Watershed and just all these agencies in terms of this project that we started talking about 50 years ago, more than that. And it's finally kind of going again, and I'm having to just kind of go with the flow on that, because I have a lot of, I run down into the creek as well. I have an area that in the winter it floods up, that's when they remove the dam, it's gonna change things, and so they're going to redo that whole area too. So they're gonna be removing a lot of stuff, then adding a lot of stuff, we do a lot of plantings. I have a lot of dead trees, like you're saying, they're just, widowmakers basically, snags that come down regularly. There's a number that are gonna come down, but when they came out and did an assessment, the Urban Watershed folks in particular were fired up that I kept my snags and I had some debris piles and things because it's habitat. And so they think in those terms, and we just came out and did a bunch of planting just to try to maintain a certain amount of vegetation, but my impression is it kind of depends whether some removal is good and some removal they want to maintain, replanting, how far back, it's hard to know where until they rechannel all that creek, so I guess I'm in a position where I just know it's unclear right now and I'm just working with these various agencies, but I'm gonna basically have to go with the recommendations of the experts that are kind of controlling this project, and I'm, gotta pick my battles and I want it to be good overall in the end, but there are gonna be some interesting conversations or pain points.
Well, I even went up to Clackamas Community College in March, and they have a class on how to properly keep your forestry healthy. Keep them so far apart and this and that,
And maintenance.
and I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. It was only 4 hours.
Well, it's funny for us being here like this, because my dad, he's a tree farmer, but non-commercial, lives in a forest and maintains forest land, we do that in other places just to kind of maintain forest, but that's the thing, you spend a lot of work clearing certain things and keeping a forest healthy. This is a little bit different, it's not the forest, and then it confuses the city ordinances, and our situation is a little different than someone has a yard and they wanna cut down the tree. And then there's no trees in the yard, that's kind of a different thing where they wanna maintain a certain percentage.
Or
So-
tear one down and put up a garage or something.
Yeah, exactly, so I'm having to take it all with a grain of salt. But it's just been unclear for 15 years.
Well, and you're acknowledging, I think what you're acknowledging is sometimes conflicting purposes, I
Yes.
guess, of. If I understood you right, you're saying, for example, the Watershed Council might be excited that you've got some habitat piles or that you've maintained some snags for wildlife and whatnot. And in a flood context, that might not always be right, because it's things that are gonna then wash down.
But they're also wanting to, a big effort on this project is to try to get funds and to get help me in terms of all of the invasives that are down there too, because the knotweed and the blackberries and just there's all sorts of things, and I have a large enough property that they really need to mitigate that, so that they can allow for all the native stuff to grow, so they're saving stuff, but also removing a lot of stuff. And so I don't know how that's gonna affect, but they are experts in this, and so they know the balance and the net loss, just all of these balance points. But their priorities are maybe a little bit different than cities or mine or the neighborhoods or whatever, and so it's a matter of trying to figure out how to balance out, trying to echo Dodge, all of them, so.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's just my experience where I'm not expecting to get any clear answer really, because I know it's still, over the next year, it's kind of up in the air. It's kind of working different group.
Right. Well, I think it's a good reminder that there are some potentially, that for sure intersecting, but sometimes maybe competing
Mhm,
code
mhm.
code requirements. In general, I think, and we're trying to take this opportunity to have them work together. But sometimes, like the residential tree code is wanting things that are a little bit different than the natural resource code does, and then this flood regulations about what you're doing. They are all in the neighborhood of generally kind of wanting the same thing, but not all exactly the same thing. So to be fair, I think what I was trying to say before when you asked like, are things set in stone? It's true, they haven't been adopted. I can't give you clear answers yet about everything. What I wanted to say though is, and part of what we wanted to make clear in this meeting as a public information meeting is that a little bit different than other times when we're adjusting the code. We are trying to engage with property owners and people in the community to find out where there might be the best compromise, so that the rules work the best, for everyone's interest, or at least so there's compromise. And the clarification I want to make is that I think we're trying to figure out how to make it work well, but I don't know that we're gonna end up with a lot of wiggle room. Like this no net loss principle, we have to find a way to make that work. It can't be, we can't, despite whatever people's comments might be, we can't end up saying, you know what, FEMA, we decided not to do the no net loss thing. We did it on 2 of the 3. So we're gonna have to find a way to meet the standard. It's just not totally clear yet how we'll do it. And some of the questions that you're raising are highlighting areas where we can maybe explore a little bit and see if we, it helps to have a discretionary path so that if you can't meet the clear and objective, you have this alternative. And so that at least we're getting clarity about when I take a tree out because it's dead near the creek, am I having to, replant, and if so, where, just to make those things clear, so.
That makes a lot of sense, it's discretionary because there's tree thinning in my area, there's over excessive trees in his area. The one thing I would ask is, rather than, as you just said, sometimes when you triangulate 3 different policies within the city of Milwaukee, so it's tree code, floodplain.
Natural resource.
Natural resources, then it not be left to the citizens to figure those 3 things that you all internally have some clarity on. How are these things gonna be?
You're saying you'd like for us to figure that out so that you are presented
Right,
with
so
the
that
same.
when we come forward, we're not having to run around with 3 offices.
Right,
You all sit here together.
right,
Sort of like bring these things together. We all want the same thing. It's a beautiful community with gorgeous trees and a beautiful river that flows through it.
Yeah.
We all want the same thing. So it's just hard when it's the individual citizens having to go around and try to ask government to talk to each other.
right.
And you're having a hard time too. I mean, I remember the first go around with the Kellogg for Cocoa, probably 25 meetings with all, Fish and Game, federal.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like super fun, county, ODOT, TriMet, and no one could really, we all wanted the same thing, but it was very difficult, and it finally kind of just fell apart, and now it's coming back together. I know that,
Yeah.
I know that you're in watershed, so the county has to jive with the city code, and then there's the FEMA federal stuff, and then Fish and Game, the tribes. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that are trying to coordinate, so they're trying to figure it all out, and so I'm kind of patient with it, but it is frustrating, it's unclear.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on that, I have, all these years, we've been living on our property for about almost 20 years. And I don't know what a habitat conservation area is about. What are the rules? What are the ordinances? I've Googled it, and I don't really know, and none of our neighbors know what it really is. They'll say, well, I think we can't build a fence here. I think, no one knows. And so we're calling you folks and saying, okay, well, as long as you let water run through that shed, But I think it'd be great if there was some education to all of us who live in the flood area. Just send us something in the mail, what is an
The
HCA?
definition.
North Platte urban watershed,
Where do you
help
find
with that,
flooding?
stream sites stewards and all of that were, you know, they've reached out, I've worked with them for, yeah, it's about 19 years I've been here and
Optimus
you go,
watershed.
it's North Platte urban watershed. And they run streamside stewards, they're the ones that are kind of heading up a lot of this, but I mean, being a property owner on some of these waterways, every year you can go, they take a tour of some of these spots and you can kind of see what's going on. And they're a resource to some degree of, you know, I mean, that's what they do full time is to try to maintain good, you know, balance between the urban and the natural resource. So they've been useful for me, but they don't always have the answers either.
They
Just
don't
trying to
either.
work through it, but they would have a better sense of the overall, yeah, like what limitations.
Well, I've always found my neighbors were real good at telling me what I can't do.
I was gonna say, I was a banker for over 45 years and I was a mortgage banker a lot of that time. And then the last part, before I did a big remodel in my house, I checked and found out the rules that you're in the floodplain if any part of your property's in. So the way you get out of it and work with FEMA is you have to do a survey to get the legal description to show the part that's out of it. And when you do that, then they'll go ahead and you can do your building like you're out of the floodplain, your whole property for whatever you're doing. So that was really good key. That was great, except guess what? The floodplain changes. They changed the 100-year floodplain. So I think I'm gonna have to do that again.
I did that the last time when they remapped and
Yeah.
my property's odd, so some of it is fully floodplain, I mean,
Sure.
it runs into the lake, I mean, a lot of my property, so that's kind of an unclear thing,
Yeah.
but
So I'm gonna have to find out and probably get a new survey at least 2 or 3 feet higher than the current one to show that I'm still out. Otherwise, if I would wanna get a remodel, and I'd have to get a permit of some kind. Otherwise, I'd be sucked in and I'd have to follow all the rules.
my actual house ended up being with the remapping, like a foot I wasn't in, and then it was like less than a foot in, and it was I had all these requirements, the rate scope and all that, so I petitioned for them to, and I paid to have a surveyor come out, and it was a risk, you know, I spent a lot of money,
Oh, I
it was gonna come
I get it.
down to an inch or so, and you know, where do I measure from, on the dirt, the grass, and it comes down to that much.
Yeah.
You know, that was a big risk, but luckily it was in my favor, they remapped it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's changing all the time, and it's just my
Not all the
house,
time,
is
but
off, but then the rest is down.
Who
You know,
changes it?
So I
FEMA
was
or the
way out
city?
here, I can do it again and. So I was over 17 feet out of
Oh, that
it,
helps.
so I can do it again and be no problem.
Well, to Roy's question, I guess, can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say the floodplain changes? Are you saying
The 100-year floodplain,
information from FEMA?
yes, yeah, that's what we look at as mortgage bankers. You look and see if they're in or out. Of course, if you go straight to them, they just say, oh, the whole property's in, it's not, it's usually like what I did. And so I found out then the rules and how you get out. You get a survey, you turn it in to FEMA, and they change your map.
If you're looking.
And you make a note that I'm out.
And I ask in part because my impression is that I don't know exactly the age of the flood insurance maps, flood insurance rate maps that we're working with right now
Sure.
that show the 100-year floodplain. I had the impression that,
They were done in around
For better or worse.
2005 or 8.
Yeah.
I think 10 was around then, maybe, or.
okay, but it had, I had the impression that it didn't change that often.
It didn't. The
In
last
terms of
time
the
it changed
information
was sometime
you get.
before the 50s.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, it's been a while. But if we're gonna have climate change and other stuff happening, maybe in 10 years it'll change again, or let's do it.
Right, well, and I guess what I want to clarify or see if I'm understanding right is that it seems like for better or worse, one limitation is that FEMA does not update the map information that regularly, I think. But it does happen on occasion, I guess,
Yes.
and it is a good reminder to know that we have to work with whatever the latest or the information that we have. But it seems,
Mortgage bankers look at that too.
That's how I was feeling.
it seems to me that it's understood that the maps are frustratingly inaccurate too, though. I mean,
Yeah.
even if they say, you know, the base flood elevation or that elevation of concern is, let's say, 38 feet here, and we look at a map with some topo elevation information on it, and we see overlaid what is shown on the floodplain map, and we overlay it with the elevation, so we can see, well, there's a bunch of area that's in the floodplain that's like 42, it's like higher.
Yes.
Why, what is this, and there are areas sometimes on the site that are 36, but they're not in the floodplain, so I think that the understanding I'm coming to about this is that I'm supposed to use the flood maps as a guide, especially with respect to identifying what is the base flood elevation. So that rather than when we look at the map of your property and we see where the floodplain line is, just because the house is out of it, I have to look more at what is the base flood elevation, and then we can kind of see like, so where's your house elevation, and once we confirm, oh, it's well above, like, so yes, truly you are not in a floodplain situation, but that we really should be regulating if it's, you know, even if the map is wrong or is inaccurate, but it turns out the elevation is below the base flood, we should be helping you protect property, so.
Two questions, how do you find out the flood? And two is how far from the creek can you develop?
Well, I don't have the exact web address, although I can show you, let me share the screen, and I also will take this opportunity to say it looks like we have 3 people who are participating online, and I will try to keep an eye, if you have a question, raise a hand, use the raise a hand feature or something, and maybe someone can help me see that, and we can pull you in and have you ask your question if you have one. In the meantime, let me share again. And I will show you. I escape out of this.
I'm sure.
Well,
What's this?
sorry, let me, close that. I'm trying to close that. Okay, let me try this again. Okay, so on. I don't know if I have it here, but let me search, there's a FEMA, if you search for
FEMA flood.
FEMA Service Center. There's a FEMA Flood Map Service Center. So you can do that search that I just did, and you can enter an address, give me, just give me a.
Yeah, 3905 Southeast Johnson.
I don't even know.
3905?
Mm-hmm.
So it's gonna show you maps. And you are here, let me. And some. So this is the site.
City of Portland, right?
Just,
the creek runs, in the city of Portland. I don't know if that matters.
so it looks like, yeah, you may have floodplain on the property, it looks like it's fairly far away from, I don't know, this isn't really showing property boundaries, but does this seem, I mean, it seems like, this is Johnson Creek
Yeah.
back here.
I go straight back to the creek.
Yeah, so this is, what this is showing is, some of these numbers are, this 87.1, I think is the base flood elevation in this area.
Okay.
So if you were doing things, especially anything in the blue area, I think we'd wanna double check.
Okay.
You know, what's happening, and then,
So it's less about how far back from the creek it is, and it's more about is it in a flood zone?
for the flood stuff,
For the
yes.
flood zone.
We asked a general question about how far away from the creek can you be, there's these other, the natural resource rules may come into play as well, that are separate from the flood stuff. There may be some kind of review, but not not related to our flood projections. Not things that would make you raise, above a certain elevation, that kind of thing. There may still be a review for, I'm gonna remove some vegetation really close to the creek or new development close to the creek that,
Gotcha. Thank you.
let's see. So yeah, that could be a resource if people haven't seen this, you can go to
That's good to
this FEMA website and look to see kind of for your property what it's showing in terms of this is that floodway. This kind of crosshatch area, and then the blue is the 100-year floodplain, the orange is a 500-year floodplain, and again, our current regulations just deal with the blue 100-year floodplain.
So is that 2004, is that applicable to the floodplain, or is that, what is that? Effective 10/19/2004.
2008.
I'm not sure what that particular note means, if that's when this measurement was taken, this note is saying the map, this is a map from 2008, but it may be that whatever actual survey work happened might have been in 2004, I'm not sure, but
So the
point
floodplain
being,
started 20 years ago.
it's been a while, yeah, that's what I was saying, like the floodplain does change, like physically, sure it changes, but we don't have information from FEMA that's any older than, what is that, 18 years? Or 16 years?
And you can also petition to change it, so if you do development in a floodplain, and then you let FEMA know, they'll come through and update those maps to adjust the floodplain based on any fill that you added. So that may be a development stuff in 2004. That it altered the floodplain, and that's when it was changed.
Seven, and eight.
Yeah, great question. Other questions?
Thank you.
I would say that, I'm assuming that you all who are here, you did receive the letter that we
Yeah.
sent. And what we will do is we will use that same mailing list when we're preparing for that first planning commission. They're gonna make a recommendation. They don't make the decision, but they have to hear it first and then make a recommendation then to the city council. But for that meeting, we will send that out to you. Again, if you want, I don't know that I'm gonna have more updates between now and then, but if you want to put your name down and an email address, I can at least make sure that I double cover. And then, email you a notice of the meeting or whatever you'd like to do with that.
That'd be great, because I didn't get a letter.
You
So
did
my-
not?
My colleague, my friend,
Okay, okay. What do
But I
you,
think because I'm in Portland, my creek is on Portland.
That's just the name of the map. Yeah.
So 97222 at the post office comes up in Portland.
It's say,
Well, no, I
like
really
50
don't know the
post
tax,
office.
okay, city of
Oh,
Portland tax,
oh,
for that land on the creek,
Hmm.
okay, city of Portland,
okay, so your property may actually be outside the city of Milwaukee,
correct.
could be, okay. Well,
Well,
then,
the property is,
The property.
the house is, city of Milwaukee,
but the creek
the
part,
creek is, so I take Clackamas in.
so that's why you would.
Good times, good times.
Well, so are there kind of two properties? Okay, well, so you wouldn't have gotten one at your home address, I guess, because that property isn't in the floodplain, I guess. Okay, so that explains, alright, okay.
Give me an exception to your.
My contact information is on that letter, if you have other thoughts or questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. And I don't wanna keep anyone longer than you wanna be here, if you have more questions, I'm happy to try to answer them and talk more. And I don't see that anyone online has asked anything, but are there other thoughts, concerns, wonderings?
Appreciate the outreach.
Appreciate it,
For,
yeah.
seeing how this developed. Expecting clear answers.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I appreciate the questions because they're helpful for knowing what we need to be able to answer as this moves forward and what you're gonna.
One question I have, if I do have to and required to replant, who chooses what type of tree? Does the city tell me what type, or do I? If I want a Douglas
Oh,
fir
that's interesting.
versus something else,
Mhm.
a maple or alder,
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I've seen, what I think I've seen in the model ordinance doesn't specify, but when I looked at some of the guidance documents that they provided for us, like if you were gonna do this more discretionary permit by permit thing, the suggestion seemed to be, it should be a similar type of tree, like if it was an older growing evergreen, it should be replaced with a similar type of evergreen kind of tree. So again, that I do feel like is still a little bit up in the air in terms of what will we land on to.
to do that.
No, like I said,
It's
we
like
do
that
have
confusing
some
to me.
trees removed.
But when the urban watershed came out to kind of do an assessment and they brought out one of their experts that was an academic on trees, and I mean, we talked generally in getting rid of invasive and replanting natives, but this gentleman that came out, I mean, he was so specific on my property, even within, I don't know, 200 feet, every like 5 feet, and he's like, okay, and then this would be this type of tree and this type of tree and up here, and just very, very specific, and so the watershed was taking his expertise, and I don't know if that's any kind of requirement, but they definitely had recommendations that were very interesting about the shading and about the types of soil and about the interaction.
And what about size? Do you plant a 4-foot tree or a seedling or,
I think that's also kind of
you know?
the detail that he gets into.
There's a 5-foot, you can't do anything smaller than 5 feet.
Okay, there you go.
We're like partially on my property with watershed, we plant like 1,000 small seedlings and shrubs and of various types, and a lot of it doesn't make it, but. So I don't know, that's definitely small stuff, but when they redo the creek bed, they're gonna put in bigger things. Just so that they can propagate more quickly, do what they need to do, so, yeah. Curious to see how.
Yeah, that gets at some of the expertise that's involved with people doing those kinds of restoration and replanting.
Well, like I said, you want an expert, just ask your.
Yeah.
He'll figure it out.
I would have no problem, but. Appreciate your time, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Yes.
Yeah, nice seeing you again.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I'm gonna thank you folks online for joining us. I'm gonna stop the recording.
When is there?